actually unite us. Okay. Welcome. We are recording. So nice for you to just be here tonight. I'll just start this slide over. And on the flip side, this toxic polarization is less likely to occur when we view each other through the lenses of these cross-cutting identities. And those are identities that unite us as human beings. Just as there are many identities that help to comprise the complexity known as you and me, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're American, maybe you're educated, Jewish, an artist, a fan of the show Ted Lasso, right? These are all identities that we hold. There are also layers of identities in the person on the other side, that person over there. And when we've fallen victim to singular rigid identities, we forget that we have multiple identities and that other people do as well. So to recap and drive this home, we're gonna just quickly view this 3-minute video from our friends at Over Zero. Give me 1 second because I don't think that it's sharing audio in this moment. There we go. Okay. Let's try that.
A brief introduction to social identity.
Everybody here?
When it comes to understanding the type of conflict and violence that happens between groups, it's really important to understand groups. Being a part of a group is in some ways the most fundamentally human thing. Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs puts belonging just above our basic physical needs, and it is at the center of our species' evolutionary strategy, our ability to coordinate as a group to survive and thrive. The groups we are part of form pieces of our social identity, parts of who we are and how we see ourselves. Each of us carry many identities, whether it's our identity as a mother, daughter, baseball fan, our religion, or our political party. These are the anchors that tell us and the world around us who we are and where we can find belonging. And while some identities are chosen by us, many are given to us, whether we like it or not, like race, religion, or language. When we feel anxious, stressed, or scared, we seek safety in our groups, and our group identities become even more important to us. So we associate our safety and survival with that of our group. To protect our groups, and through them ourselves, we are attuned to be extra sensitive to threats to that group, whether those threats are real, perceived, or constructed. Once groups see each other as threats or competitors, the identities of each group become more singular and rigid. We are more likely to see us as one like-minded, uniform collective, while we see them just as one monolithic block. With unifying and cross-cutting identities pushed to the side, intergroup conflict will often be seen as zero-sum. I win, you lose. You win, I lose. Compromise isn't an option, and group members who advocate for it are likely to be silenced, punished, or even seen as traitorous. In this situation, further polarization, conflict, and even violence become possible. So what does this mean for how we can prevent and counteract polarization, conflict, and violence between groups? First, it's essential to understand the role that our social identities play in conflict. What are the identities that are being activated for conflict? How does this impact people's responses to things like criticisms of members of their groups or competitiveness with other groups? So what can we do? One thing is to remember that we all have multiple identities. In conflict, we can be driven into just one part of our identity. It's important to take action to prevent that. Can we find bigger identities that unite us? Can we keep alive the cross-cutting identities that let us connect across conflict lines? To learn more, download the social identity information sheet in the video description. A brief introduction to social.
Great. So a couple just key items, ideas that we're going to come back to here. We have polarization, identity, perception, groups. These are things that we're talking about more of tonight. And we want to know, why are we thinking this? Why are we acting this way? What's happening with us? Last week, we saw these and we asked you, what'd you see? What did we all see? We saw faces, right? But actually what we saw were seatbelt and backpack and bathtub and a trailer hitch, a cheese grater, and a crazy looking pepper, right? And our minds quickly interpret and sort these abstract items as faces, and we label them as friends or foe really quickly. And why do we do that? That's because of her, this lioness. And hundreds of thousands of years ago, we looked out into the grasslands as we were walking around, and if we saw a lion where there was only grass, then our bodies were activated. We were ready to run or fight. But if we looked out and didn't see the lion, then we were all dead, and so was our gene pool. We evolved actually to look for faces, and not only to look for faces, but to register whether those faces were friend or foe. And we do this so fast. How fast? We make assessments in a matter of milliseconds. It's our evolutionary biology at work. And we create groups automatically with this. Now, we do this, and we create groups because we know from evolution that it's so much easier to go up against this lioness when we have a group to back us up, all right? Wolves, like many human beings, live in these extended families, which are called packs, and this pack life ensures the care and feeding of the young and allows these wolves to defend their common territory. Wolves live in packs because cooperation allows them to bring down larger prey. That group mentality is key for our survival. Once we find ourselves as part of a group, then we know that we have to stay in that group, and its survival is actually linked to our survival. And we know that in so many instances, we are willing to do almost anything to stay in that group, lest we be kicked out and have to fight the lions or the wolves on our own. And so we say, what are we going to do? You know, this picture up here, the guy's like, no, I'm not joining your silly little picture. I'm not getting in your dance. And then finally he's like, okay, fine, I'm in. I'm all in because you guys are my best friends and I can't lose you, right? So we are deeply influenced by the group norms, which are often shaped by the loudest people in the room. When we talked about walking into the cafeteria on the first day of school, I shared with you, dating myself, that the song that came to mind was Tevin Campbell's key song for our series, which was "Can We Talk," right? Which is what we're all here to do. So our knee-jerk reactions are biologically driven, and we need each other, and we don't want to sit at the table by ourselves. And we have to find a crew. We have to find our pack. We have to find community. Studies have shown that loneliness is as detrimental to our health as smoking. So that's a real quick just overview of where we came from last week and some of the key concepts here and why we've evolved to think and live the way that we do. I'm going to turn it over to Kavod now. Rabbi Kavod, you want to take us through a little bit? We talked about some key concepts here, and we're going to take some time here. Go ahead, talk to us a little about what we're going to do next.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to take a little time to journal. And what I recommend is if you have a piece of paper and a pen by, as opposed to typing on the computer, there's something about actually writing, handwriting, that engages a different part of our brain. But what I'd like you to reflect on is, how does this show up in your own life? And I want you to think back to the idea of the cafeteria at school. You walk into the cafeteria and you're immediately looking to see who are the safe people to sit next to, who's going to welcome me, what are the people that I want to kind of stay away from. Think about if there are ways that you do this in your own life. You can even think about the temple, of where does it come into where you start to feel like, you approach a situation, what kinds of people seem safe to you? What kinds of people, not so much? What are the in community, what are the people that you gravitate towards, and what are the people that you have a reaction towards? I'm not going to ask anybody to share in this large group. This is just for your own reflection. But take about 4 or 5 minutes right now to just do a little bit of journaling. It doesn't just have to be in temple. It can be in other kind of social environments that you're in your life. Where do you make snap decisions about who a person is, who's safe, that kind of thing. So, and if not, if you don't find yourself doing this at all, write a little bit about that, a little bit of reflection. So we'll take about 4 or 5 minutes and then come together. We'll just take about 30 more seconds. So you can kind of finish up some thoughts. You're also welcome to write more about this later, to reflect more about how do the kind of these dynamics that we're learning about, talking about, show up. So just for a moment, Sasha, can we stop the screen sharing so that we can all see each other? And just before, we're about to move into some new material, but before we do, I just wanted to see, does anybody have any questions about any of the material presented so far, or any aha moments that you want to share, or or kind of reflections about this dynamic, not necessarily personally in your own life, but unless you want to, but anything that you need in order to feel complete about what we've been exploring. Everybody good? We're all okay, wonderful. So Chandra, I'll turn it over to you as we move forward.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share screen here with sound. Great. All right, can you all see what happens when groups collide? Yes, all right, great. I got the non-dominant hand thumbs up, I think. So, okay. So you've talked a little bit so far about how you get into groups, how those groups form, why we want to stay in those groups, what is so important about that to us and how it shapes who we are. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when groups come together, especially in an environment where we are so toxically polarized as we are these days. So as we're thinking about this, I'd love to hear, has there ever been a time in your life when you, looking back, realize that you had changed your behavior towards someone because of something that you assumed about them? So kind of hearkening back to the text study earlier, talking about questions and expanding our view and our ability to engage with others. Has there ever been a time when you did the opposite of that, when you changed the way you would behave towards someone because of something that you assumed about them? Does anyone have something to share along those lines?
I mean, I've noticed that I haven't been, that sometimes I'm not as forthcoming about my thoughts or opinions about a given topic or whatever because of the assumptions that I make of how that person would respond to me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Chandra, I was at a store the other night and I tried to get the gentleman's attention who was working there, and I called from the side and I called back and I was like, this guy, dude, man, there's another, like, this guy's, like lazy, he just doesn't want to work. He doesn't want to help me. It's like, I needed some help. It's a big box, hardware store, and I'm completely lost in my element. And I'm like, hey, excuse me, sir, can you help? And nothing. I'm totally getting ignored here. And I walk around and he's doing something on the computer, and I kind of go up and I say, and I'm right in front of him. I'm like, excuse me, sir, can you help me with something? I'm looking for something. Nothing. I get nothing. I just kind of wave down, and he looks up and he shows me his badge. And he says, his badge says, hello, I'm deaf. Please tap me on the shoulder if you need assistance. And I was like, oh my God, I completely made an assumption about this guy that he was like, not willing to, want to work, or maybe he's getting close to his punch out time. And I was completely wrong.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sasha. That's actually a good example of another science concept that we sometimes talk about at the One America movement. And Sasha did not plant that story, but we talk often about motive misattribution or motive attribution asymmetry, where we think we know the motives that someone else has. Oh, I just want to clock out, right? And really, we're totally wrong about those motives. But too often we change how we act because we assume we know something about someone else, especially when that person is someone who is across that group divide. And even more, especially when it is that toxically polarized divide that is our politics today.
I think just a clarification, sorry, on what Kevin said is I definitely can relate to assuming how someone will respond versus making assumptions about them. So in some cases, and I see both. So I see where I've changed my behavior towards someone because it's not what I've assumed about them, it's what I know about them. I'm assuming how they'll react based on what I know about them. Then there's the other is when you just talked about like based on someone who like I don't know, based on who their group is or what they look like or things like that, I'm going to make assumptions. I think part of the writing is like, you know, am I safe? And that might, you know, be something where I would change the behavior because I assumed something about them. So that's not knowing them. So it's kind of like clarifying. I think I totally get and I'm sure that's where we're diving in, is making assumptions about people you don't know. It's more about the people that you do know enough about them that even though we have all those identities that we talk about, still based on what we do know, even though we've got these shared identities, this overriding difference kind of seeps into all those things that like we could normally connect as parents. But if you intrinsically believe this and I intrinsically believe that, then as parents, we're raising our kids differently. Like, so it's like trying to find that common ground, but when the divide is deeper than that. So I think there's two, like what you know, and then just making assumptions about what you don't know. So
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for drawing that distinction, because, you know, I think often people assume that what we're saying is, oh, don't worry, there aren't actually extremists out there. Or if you just talk to someone, you're going to realize that you actually agree on things. And that isn't the case, right? There are people out there who are extreme, and there are people in all of our, you know, lives and our interpersonal interactions that, yeah, I know how this person thinks about this particular issue, and I don't want to talk about it with them today, you know, and that's a perfectly valid, you know, way to engage, or, you know, protecting yourself, as you mentioned, you know, is it safe? Am I safe in this conversation? You know, we have to leave room for that for sure. And challenge ourselves to be able to be surprised by people that we do know. And how do we ask those questions that allow us to get underneath the why behind people's opinions? So I agree, there are definitely different aspects as to whether we're making an assumption about a person that we don't know or someone we do know, and we're assuming how they would react to something that we say. So I'm gonna do a quick little thought experiment. I have 3 questions, and I'd ask you to open up your chat box, and in the chat box, just put, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being completely civilized, completely uncivilized, and 10 being completely civilized, where would you rank members of your own political party on a scale of 1 to 10? I have to find the chat so I can see. So 1's uncivilized, 10 is civilized. We've got some 5s, marginally average, 7. Any other reflections on that? I don't know if that captures our whole group. 8, 7s and 8s. Gail, 4. Our own political parties are not as civilized, maybe, as we would want them to be. So on a scale of 1 to 10, the same scale, where would you rank members of the other political party, except William, who's no longer in a party? threes, fours, five. So on the whole, less than how we would rank our own political party generally. Now, let's think about what those people might be thinking of us, because whenever we're talking about how groups collide, what we're really talking about is not only what we think about people on the other side of a divide, but also what we think they are thinking about us. That's going to change our behavior as well. So on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 uncivilized and 10 civilized, where do you think other people on the other side of the political spectrum would rank you? What would people in the other party think about you? Getting more 2s and 3s. We often do this exercise with an online tool we call Slido, which is where you do a QR code with your telephone and then type your answer in, and it goes straight on the screen, and we can see, as it pops up, the average of the different groups. And it's fascinating to look at these answers kind of side by side and think, okay, if I'm viewing myself as or my group as a 6 or an 8, and I think that other people are a 4 or a 5, then what are they thinking about me? And all of a sudden we realize, oh wait, there's something just not quite right here. So toxic polarization tries to convince us of some pretty dangerous myths. Now, before we jump into those, I want to acknowledge that, as I said, there are people out there who are extreme. And there are people who might target different groups with hate. And so I don't want to diminish that is a reality in the world in which we live, especially after the situation that happened today, the situation in Buffalo last week, and so many incidents that have happened before that and sadly are likely to happen in the future. But even as we recognize that there are dangerous people out there, we can also recognize that toxic polarization is driving us further and further apart, and it's obscuring the realities that are there about our opinions and our beliefs and how close we might actually be. So the 3 myths that I want to kind of dive into a little bit more today are: 1, the myth that the people on the other side of our divides are extreme; 2, that the people on the other side of our divides hate us; and 3, that the people on the other side of our divides aren't actually quite human, or maybe they're not as human as we are. So we'll just take these one by one. First, the myth that people across the divide are extreme. So over and over, the social science research suggests that we are really bad at guessing what other people think about some of our country's most hot button issues. Specifically, More in Common and Beyond Conflict, 2 of the organizations that we work with pretty regularly, do research into this idea of the perception gap. That I think that I know what someone across the political divide thinks about a certain issue, and my thought is that those people are really extreme in their views, so therefore we could never work together on anything. So I'm going to show you a slide now that shows a little bit about these perception gaps, and it gives us some very specific examples. So I'll explain how this graph is set up first, and then I'll give you a minute to just look at it and kind of soak it in, because there's a lot of information on this page. And this comes from More in Common's Perception Gap Report. And the way they did this research, they talked with Republicans and Democrats, and they asked them their actual views on a number of different hot button issues. And then they also asked them what they thought the other political party would say to answer that question. And then they figured out what is the gap between what people actually believe and what people across the divide think those people believe. So let's just take the second one down here on the left-hand side. It is an interesting one. So the statement that they said is, how much do you agree on a scale of 0 to 100 with the statement that racism still exists in America? Does racism still exist in America? The red dot indicates where Republicans would place themselves on that spectrum from disagree to agree on a scale of 0 to 100. But when you look at the blue dot, Democrats estimated that Republicans would put themselves only at around 50. So when we see the gap between Republicans' actual views and Democrats' estimates of those views, we see there's a gap of 28 percentage points. So that's a pretty big difference. And you can look at this sheet and it shows a range of different issues, from racism to policing to our views about being an American, to socialism. So I'll just give you a moment to look at these perception gaps before we move on. Is anything sticking out at you as you look at this data? Anything surprising?
I find it surprising the agreement on Donald Trump.
Oh, the Donald Trump is a flawed person one?
Yeah.
What is surprising to you about that?
That well, first of all, I guess not, but the percent of the Republicans that think he's flawed is so close to what the Democrats think the Republicans are.
Mm-hmm. So not the gap, the lack of the perception gap on that one.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. And is there anybody else have a reflection on any of those gaps?
I was just thinking, thankfully, there looks like there's some agreement about climate change.
Yeah, I think there are some aspects that are surprising. You know, if we think that we're, 30, 40, 50 points apart in our agreement, then why would we even try to talk to people about this issue that we care so much about? But whenever we look at this and we say, well, maybe we're not quite as far apart as we think we are, well, then we can have a conversation, right? We can start thinking about ways that we could compromise or explore all the different intricacies of an issue beyond kind of the binary yes or no. Do you like Trump or do you not? Are you pro-gun or no? We can start talking about some of the more of the details.
So the just the bottom one, because it's easier on the right hand side. It's you agree with you disagree that like the US should abolish ICE.
Right.
Disagree. So you agree that you disagree on the.
So do you disagree with the statement the US should abolish ICE?
Correct.
One that I find really surprising, and it's really very significant for today, is the one having to do with law-abiding citizens should have the right to bear arms. In that case, it seems like the Democrats are basically agreeing with that, at least almost 75% of them, but the Republicans, on the other hand, feel that less than 50% of them actually do. And this is, I think, where they feel that they're trying to take our weapons away from us, when almost 75% of the Democrats agree that they should be allowed to bear arms.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm noticing about most of these statements is that most of these statements are not certain specific policy recommendations. They're more about either overall perceptions or values or things that are a little bit more, it seems like a lot of where the real disagreement can come is when we get more specifically about how specifically do we express a value that's important to us through a policy decision or through something concrete. But if you take the question, back to either values or more of these kind of general perceptions, we find that perception gap is larger. There actually is more agreement in these values, and I think that's just a really important thing to because when you started getting in the previous slide, which was around other people are either hate me or are extreme or all of these things, it seems like we confuse a little bit disagreements on policy things with disagreement on values.
Yeah, absolutely. And, right now, actually, Beyond Conflict is doing research specifically on democratic norms and values, like norms and values of democracy, and what is the perception gap around that. So Republicans think that Democrats do not value the democratic norms and vice versa. And when that disconnect happens and we see other people as not valuing the norms of democracy, it makes it much easier for us to go against the norms of democracy, because we say, well, we have to protect democracy against these people who don't value those norms. So this perception gap is actually a pretty dangerous thing. But whenever we get past kind of the big questions of norms and values and identity and get to the conversation, well, then you can disagree on how we execute, right? How do we implement those different policies? But if we're never going to even get to that conversation because we can't get past this. All right, so I can also put in the chat at the end of this a link to the perception gap report, because it has so much great information in it and kind of dives into more about how they kind of went about all of this research too. So I will include that at the end of this as well in the chat. So that second myth that people across the divide hate you. This is what social scientists call meta perceptions, or negative meta perceptions. This idea that we know what somebody across the divide is thinking, and they're thinking that they hate us, or, you know, to go back to kind of that cafeteria analogy, you know, we walk into the room and we see the cool kids table, and what do we think those cool kids are thinking about us, right? I'm not cool, I'm a nerd, my clothes aren't right, my friends aren't right, my family's not right. And really, those people probably aren't thinking about us much at all, right? But these negative meta perceptions also really influence how we engage across those divides. So what do we do if we think someone hates us? Sadly, often we hate them back, or we change the way we might engage with them otherwise. And the third myth is that people across the divide aren't exactly human. And this is a very scary thing, because whenever we start dehumanizing one another, we can easily move towards harm of people across that divide. And there's a lot of research around this as well, that our partners at Beyond Conflict have done in the past, looking at active dehumanization. So actually equating people across the divide with species that aren't human. And what happens in our brains, and actually the empathic centers in our brains stop reacting whenever the subject of the conversation has been dehumanized. So we stop being able to show empathy for people across the divide if we are viewing them as less than human. And we know that across history and across the globe, whenever we see this kind of dehumanizing rhetoric happening, that has often led to mass atrocities and some of the worst aspects of our human history. We can go back and pinpoint these kinds of dehumanizing rhetoric that happen in advance of those things. And here's a graph of what Republicans and Democrats believe that people of the other party think about them, as far as whether they're fully human or not. And Republicans and Democrats actually believe that people on the other side of their divide dehumanize them twice as much as they actually do, which is also really scary, because again, if we view other people as dehumanizing us, then that gives us some justification or license to dehumanize them as well, and to move towards violence and harm. So the more that we feel dehumanized or disliked, those negative meta perceptions from people across that divide, the more likely it is that we might actually endorse the views that are ultimately harmful to our democracy. So Beyond Conflict has done a little video that we want to show that kind of demonstrates how these three different things, this idea that people across the divide are extreme, the idea that they hate us, and this idea that they think that we aren't quite human, it shows what that really looks like in real life. So I'm going to stop my screen share for a moment and let Sasha jump in and share the video.
Okay, you seeing it? Give me a thumbs up if you can hear audio.
I feel like when I walk out into the world, I'm just waiting for somebody to start a fight.
Confederate flag waving Trump MAGA hat. Proud Boys.
If you believe in Trump,
you are automatically the worst person in the world.
If you don't agree, then don't agree. But to be angry.
Oh, we assume the other side assumes the worst of us.
I hear a lot of conservative boomers call Democrats democrats.
They just shut down somebody else completely. They just have this wall up and they don't even want to hear it.
We asked over 1,200 Americans across race, gender, ethnic, and socioeconomic divides about some political topics.
I voted for Trump.
I voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 election.
Biden.
President Donald J. Trump.
I voted for Joe Biden.
Biden for sure.
If you want to just keep it as a Republican, we can just keep it simple, but
I voted for Donald Trump.
Biden and Harris.
I voted for Joe Biden. You just had to stay silent. I was afraid to put a Trump sign in my yard.
I did not vote in the 2020 election.
Biden.
Joe Biden.
I voted for Donald Trump.
We began with immigration.
I'm a DACA recipient.
It's safer to have closed borders.
Every single human has the right to succeed.
Few people are like, just leave the door wide open. Whee!
100% of legal immigrants to be allowed to come into this country legally.
Members of each party were asked to rate their own views on immigration based on a general preference for closed or open borders. In our survey, 0 means keeping all borders completely open to all migrants, and 100 means keeping all borders completely closed to all migrants.
Maybe like 25?
I would be a 10, let's say.
I would say that I lie at 40.
Like 20.
80, 85. About a 40.
I would say 15 on that scale.
We then asked them to answer the same question, however, estimating how the average member of the other party would rate their view.
100.
10.
100.
They would probably think that me as a Democrat is a 0.
In that 10 to 20 range.
0.
probably 90 to 100.
Oh, they'd probably think that I was like 0.
10, honestly.
And finally, we shared the results of the two
Okay.
questions.
That's amazing.
Oh.
There's so much more overlap than I think we realize.
We also asked Republicans and Democrats to rate how evolved they think members of the other party would see them,
Oh, at a 0.
and then how evolved they actually view members of the other party themselves.
Like to say that they're less than human?
I wouldn't put anyone who disagrees with my views as subhuman.
They're just as human as I am.
I would also put Democrats at 100. They are human beings also.
For Republicans?
In reality, Republicans and Democrats viewed each other about twice as evolved and civilized as members of each party predicted.
Wow.
Yep.
What we see when we turn on the TV and what we read on social media does not depict that.
Sure, we don't always see the world exactly the same way, but we're not nearly as different as we think.
Does anyone have any thoughts or reactions or things that are coming up for you as you watch that and how these concepts play out in real life?
I'm curious how many people have thought about this misperception gap before. Meaning, like, I'm just curious to see a show of hands if, well, let's put it this way, let's put a show of hands if you've never thought about this concept or idea before, that we may have this big perception gap. So if you don't have your hand up, it means that you've thought about this before and realized that we probably have these big misperceptions of each other. Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, I think some of it, maybe it's the political parties themselves looking to define who they are by going to the polls, if you will, but polarizing themselves one way or another to create clear distinctions because they really underestimate the intelligence of the electorate. And I also think that the press has done a lot the media has done a lot to exacerbate this. And I've pointed out for a long time, is, you watch the elections and stuff like this, and you see the states, in many cases, they go red at some point or they go blue, but for the most part, they're all just shades of purple. There's a lot more overlap there than you would think, even in states that you think are just like that's all one way or all another way. And it's interesting. I mentioned this last week in one of the breakout groups that I was sitting around a dinner table on a cruise ship, and so we actually just do anytime dining and sit with people from all over the world actually, and so there's a bunch of us there from couple of us there from California. Somebody was there from someplace on the East Coast, and then there was another couple there from Oklahoma. And at the end, the Oklahoma guy says, "Wow, it's interesting that we're able to really have a good conversation with people that I thought were from the crazy California left people." And so one of the other people, well, I may be left, but I'm not crazy. But after they got a chance to have a conversation, they realized that we weren't all that crazy to begin with, and
Yeah, at One America, we think of the kind of the milieu that we are in as far as our media, social media, online presence, malicious foreign agents, all of this as being kind of the toxic gas that we're swimming in. And we can't even really see one another because we are being so inundated with this toxic gas that's really pushing us in these really polarized directions.
Go ahead, Judy.
One of the issues that's with media today is that there's almost too many stations. And growing up, there were like 3 stations, and they were all white men, they were all whatever. I mean, they didn't have a variety of people that were presenting the news, but they presented a kinder news. And the awful things that are happening today it's almost like it's so much of it. It's all the time. There's so many stations and so much tumult and so much noise. And you wonder when you get on AOL and you turn on your computer that you've already had news that's targeted for things that are going to be of interest or disinterest to you. So where you say you want to have neutral news, it's very rare to be able to figure out what is neutral, unbiased news that's just events and coming out. It's just a lot. It's just a lot right now. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why for us, we always go back to the relationship piece, because it's so hard to really know when we're looking through that mediated, view of the news or the media or even our social media that we're relying on to get this information in. That they're not big on giving us the why people believe what they believe aspect in the news. That's not sensational, right? Enough for the news to want to share why people believe what they believe, how they came to care about certain issues, and all of the different things that really make us human. So for us, we always want to go back to kind of the real heart of the relationship part.
Reaction.
Am I on? I'm on. Can I just weigh in here? First of all, I really appreciate this dialogue and this session. This idea about I hadn't thought about dehumanization, and we can talk about polarization of
political parties, but on a one-to-one, I was thinking, first of all, well, I can see your point of view, even though I disagree. The empathy, I can put myself in your position. We may disagree. I think would lower the idea about dehumanization. And by the way, when we were talking about what would make us comfortable with another person, and I put down, you know, the physical gestures or the smile, but what I really forgot is sometimes, you know, in certain tense situations, the sense of humor can dispel certain tensions where people will disagree, whether it's about communicating with each other, maybe political views, and that I think we all know people, dear friends who may have different views that I do, but if it's a person we know and we know, well, we can respect, people can agree to disagree, it does make getting along better without necessarily sacrificing, you know, our views. But that, I think that theme has come up today. So
I'm going to take a half step back and kind of touch back on the news media, and, you know, where do you go for your unbiased sources of information? And you know, one of the things that I like to remind people is that the news media is not in the business of informing. It's in the business of holding your attention and selling advertising. You know, and the example that I use is, I guess one of the, it's not even very recent, but, you know, the Northridge earthquake. If you look at the news after the Northridge earthquake and you lived somewhere out of the greater LA region, you would have thought that all of Los Angeles had collapsed and that every street was on fire and that all of the freeways had collapsed. When some of those things had happened, and it's not to minimize that, but the news media is not in the business of television of really informing us. You know, their only job is to keep you glued. And if you question that ever, all you have to do is watch the first 7 minutes of any news broadcast local, because at about the 5 or 6 minute mark, Dallas Raines is going to get on and say, there's big changes in the weather, but he's not going to tell you what the weather is going to do. They're going to tell you at the end. So again, you know, me personally, I get my news, I get the old I don't have it in here, but a newspaper. You know, if you want to understand something, you need more than 2.5 minutes of some talking head explaining it, and you need more than one voice being able to you know, share it with you. You need to read different views on it. But I tell people that, you know, when you turn on the news at night, you're not getting enough information to do anything other than, you know, buy the new hamburger at Arby's, you know, whatever they're selling. So that's just my feedback on that.
I have a comment about the Northridge earthquake. Our house was a few miles away from Northridge, and I thought everything was gone, except our house.
My sister gave birth at Northridge Hospital, about a block and a half from the epicenter, the night before, with twins.
Oh
So
my God.
The fact that they all survived, you know, the world didn't end. It was bad, but the world moved on. Two
thoughts about this element of media. One is, I think part of what we're trying to address tonight through this session is that because it's become so difficult to talk actually with the people in our community and in our life who think differently from us, we retreat on having our information just from these media sources. So and for many of us, as we know, you have to make a huge effort in order to try to find sources that are out of your own bubble of how you filter that information. But one thought, that I
I was reading an article on media literacy, and I think about this as not just from media, but also in conversations with people, is the way that somebody defined propaganda. And they said that propaganda is any time that information, there's two kind of qualities to propaganda. One is when information is presented in order to evoke a strong reaction. So, and that I think speaks to what you were saying, William, about my goal as a, in social media is to keep your attention, is to get you angry, is to evoke a strong emotion in some way. So one piece is that, and this can happen in conversation too. And then the second thing is to promote black and white thinking, to really promote that there's really only two ways to think about the issue: the right way and the ridiculous way, whatever that is. And so if information is being presented in that way that's trying, you can kind of realize, man, it really wants me to get upset, or I'm really kind of being, the way that this is formed and the ideas are put is really like forcing me to have to take a side in this. Then I can probably say, whether the information is true or not, it's definitely propaganda. It's definitely information that is being manipulated in some way to have me agree with a certain perspective, as opposed to getting the information or letting me make up my mind for myself.
Thank you, Rabbi Kabun. I think we're in a really beautiful place right now. I want to thank everybody for being here, and also give you a preview of where we're going to go next week in our third of 3 sessions. We're going to be putting some of this into practice, and this has been sort of learning about it, like more abstractly. We're understanding concepts. We're seeing what happens in case studies and how it's played out with other people. And in next week's session, we're going to be kind of putting all this into practice sessions with each other. And we're going to be practicing having some of these difficult conversations, and practice storytelling and practice listening, coming from this place of curiosity rather than judgment. So please join us next week. We love that you're here, and please come back. Rabbi Kavod, should we save the text for next week, or did you want to share that and close out with this?
Let's close out with that, because it really gives us, it connects us back to how we find this in our Torah and our tradition. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful text.
Beautiful.
Many of you are familiar with the story between Jacob and Esau, the two brothers who Jacob left home after tricking his brother out of the birthright, and had a whole life, and finally he gets to the place where he's about to meet. So after years of separation, and let's see what happened here. It just moved over. Let me make this a little smaller. After years of separation and division, Jacob and Esau prepare to meet. What will he do to me? Each of them wonders. They have good reason to be wary of each other. After all, Jacob stole Esau's birthright and blessing by tricking their father, and in response, Esau threatened to take Jacob's life. And so these two brothers became mortal enemies. And years later, the fear remains steadfast. Jacob feels certain that his brother Esau hates him. Esau believes the same. These meta-perceptions continue to drive the brothers apart, so much so that they prepare for their meeting as if they are going to war against one another. Yet despite of all the anxious anticipation and meta-perceptions that drive them further apart, when they finally come face to face, Esau runs to Jacob, embraces him, and kisses him, and the two weep in one another's arms. Jacob and Esau find out that they were wrong about the hatred that the other feels in his heart. They prepared for hate, but in the end they found love. We learn from Jacob and Esau that even when we feel confident we know how another thinks or feels about us, we might be wrong. Our misperception may lead us to more significant division and distrust. But if we can maintain a stance of curiosity and recognize that we could be wrong, our curiosity can lead us towards greater friendship, love, unity with others. And the one last thing I want to share about this, which seems to go along with really the theme of our learning, is the question: what allowed Jacob to go from a place where he feared his brother to be willing to greet him and connect with him? Because he had to have a willingness. He had to have a willingness to reach across the divide in his heart, his own meta perception, to allow that encounter to happen. And if you know the story, you know that Jacob has, the evening before he meets his brother, he has a dream. And in his dream, he wrestles with a mysterious presence, right? Some people say, was that the angel of Esau? Was that a part of Jacob's own psyche that he was trying to resolve? Was that an angel of God? Whatever it is, Jacob goes through this process of wrestling, of self-awareness, of self-knowledge. And so much of what these 2 sessions that we've done have been trying to look at, what are the ways that we get in our own way of being able to be open and connect? What are the dynamics that are in play? Because what I think we'll find as we even take our session next week is that, once we become aware that we bring a certain amount of bias and perception and all of those things to the other, then we also notice with that awareness that we don't have to be imprisoned within it, but we can put it aside and be open and ask questions and connect. Thank you, everybody, so much for your attention this evening. And hopefully we'll see you next week and we'll be able to continue the journey. Thank you, Sasha and Chandra. Really appreciate you guys this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Kavod. Thank you very much, friends. We'll see you next week.
for having
Hope
us.
everybody has a really nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Have a good week. Stay healthy.